Xi Jinping rallying Southeast Asian nations against Donald Trump's trade war. The Chinese leader urged them to unite against what he calls unilateral bullying by the U.S. and projected China as a source of stability. Did he succeed in winning support against America's sweeping tariffs? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Matching Donald Trump's tariff offensive with his own charm, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been on a three-nation tour of Southeast Asia. Xi is seeking to woo the region by projecting China as a source of stability in the face of global uncertainty caused by the U.S. president's tariffs on 185 countries. Southeast Asia is China's largest trading partner. But many countries like Vietnam and Cambodia also have strong business relations with America. Some have already reached out to the White House hoping to negotiate a deal during the 90-day pause on tariffs. Experts say that by excluding China, Trump's conciliatory measure is aimed at isolating it globally. So, did Xi Jinping succeed in winning over the leaders of Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia to rally against Trump's crippling trade barriers? Can Beijing fend off Washington's attempt to isolate it globally by using the tariff negotiations? We'll seek answers to these questions from our guests in a moment. But first, this report by our correspondent Katrina Yu from a rainy Beijing.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has ended his tour of Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia, calling on these neighbors to push back against what he says is U.S. hegemony and protectionism. Now, each of these countries face very high levies from the Trump administration, but China faces the highest tariffs of all, up to 245% on all of its goods going into the United States. Now, during his trip, Xi Jinping signed dozens of deals with each of these countries' leaders, and he called for the strengthening of what he described as the family of Asian nations. Another goal that Xi Jinping had during this visit was to ensure that these leaders did not cut deals at Beijing's expense when negotiating with the Trump administration to try to have those tariffs lowered. Now, China's next move is to call for an informal meeting at the United Nations Security Council to accuse the United States of bullying. Now, these escalating tensions between Beijing and Washington have spurred a sense of nationalism among Chinese people, with many supporting the government's defiance against Donald Trump.
AI-generated videos showing US President Donald Trump, Tesla founder Elon Musk, and Vice President J.D. Vance in a factory, and others showing Americans working on production lines. They are just some of the content going viral on Chinese social media in the wake of Beijing's intensifying trade war with Washington. Internet users are protesting exorbitant tariffs and making fun of the idea that the US can replace China as a manufacturing superpower.
On one hand, yes, there's maybe people who are saying, they feel targeted, but on the other side, there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing of like, yeah, you guys go ahead and cut us off because there's no way you guys are going to make this stuff without us.
Posts supporting Beijing's defiance of the Trump administration have been shared millions of times. This one reads, "We must not back down. We must stand firm and support our nation's decisions." Chinese officials are fanning nationalistic sentiment. On X, a foreign ministry spokesperson posted a speech by Communist Party founder Mao Zedong in 1953 during the height of the Korean War, saying, "We will never yield."
The Chinese government is hoping to channel nationalism into action by encouraging Chinese consumers to buy more goods made in China and support manufacturers who previously relied on the US market.
Chinese retailers and e-commerce giants have launched campaigns to help exporters sell goods to domestic shoppers instead.
When the Chinese government mobilizes all kinds of resources, when the entire country, entire society is behind it, I think the impact on China's economy is something bearable.
Hello, boss.
Some have found other ways to offset the impact of high US tariffs.
Quicker.
Using platforms such as TikTok to teach Americans how to buy direct from Chinese wholesalers and save money by bypassing big brands.
Do you want to buy laundering capsules? One port only costs 5 cents.
Posts calling for a boycott of US products in China have also gained traction, but analysts say Beijing is unlikely to support such moves. The government is determined to portray the country as a stable destination for foreign investment, a market open to all countries, including the United States. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing for Inside Story.
We'll now bring in our guest. Joining us from Shanghai is Shaun Rein, who's the director at China Market Research Group and the author of The Split, Finding the Opportunities in China's Economy in the New World Order. In Singapore is Deborah Elms, who's the head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. That's an organization specializing in trade research. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Paolo von Schirach, the president of Global Policy Institute and a professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. Shaun, over to you first. So ahead of this visit, this Southeast Asia tour, the Chinese president has warned that trade wars quote unquote, yield no winners, according to him, and that countries should work to advance a comprehensive and inclusive global economic globalization. How important, though, is this visit for China, and to what extent does it need a win here?
This was a hugely important visit, and thank you for having me. And I think it was a win for Xi Jinping. So as you mentioned earlier in the program, the former deputy prime minister of Vietnam actually visited Washington, D.C. for Vietnam to try to forge trade relations with the United States. But when she visited Vietnam, it wasn't the deputy prime minister, it was the president of Vietnam who welcomed him at the airport. It was the king of Cambodia who welcomed Xi at the airport in Cambodia. And it was the prime minister, Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, who welcomed Xi at the airport. So it was very key that not only was Xi launching a charm offensive to show that China is the stable adult in the room in international affairs, but ASEAN just tried to form strong relations with China. And that's really important for China because right now, ASEAN is China's largest trading partner, accounting for 16% of exports. Now, 8 years ago, when Trump's first administration, America was the largest trading partner, accounting for about 18% of China's exports. That number has gone down to only 14% as China has de-risked from the United States in the last 7-8 years and is focused on growing their trade with what I like to call the global majority. So that's why this was a real win for China this week. It showed ASEAN, it showed Latin America, it showed Africa, and it even showed Europe that China is the stable and trusted trading partner who is going to try to protect free trade, which has accelerated the quality of life for billions of people over the last 40 years. Big win for China this week.
Okay, besides the symbolism of all of this, we'll drill down into what was actually accomplished in a moment. But let me cross over to Paolo. Xi Jinping also said at a time of rising unilateralism and protectionism, China's economy has remained a key driver of the world economy. So is that message geared towards a domestic audience or an international audience?
Well, look, at this stage, all this is public relations. This trip was public relations, and that's what it is, to try to portray China, as your other guest indicated, as a stable element in the global trading system. Whereas America, look at America. One day is like this, the other day is like that. It is not reliable. It doesn't stick to its commitments. I mean, this doesn't affect China directly, but some of Mr. Trump's actions counter the spirit and the letter of the free trade agreement linking the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Again, this does not affect China directly, but indirectly it does. Because of many Chinese investments that have made in Mexico in order to take advantage of the preferential tariff system that that goods produced in Mexico should enjoy in principle with the United States. How this is going to pan out, we have no idea, really. The fact that the worst tariffs, except for China, have been suspended for a while. Who knows what's going to happen? Every trade expert says 90 days to negotiate, bilateral or multilateral agreements with 75, 80 countries. That seems to be the count. It's impossible. It cannot be done. It's not serious. So what does that mean in the end? Mr. Xi Jinping knows, or should know, that China is extremely unpopular in the region. The countries that he's visited are afraid of China, okay? They are not friends of China at all, except Cambodia, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of China at this point because of the preponderant influence of the country. China has irritated all its neighboring countries with this unilateral annexation of the entirety of the South China Sea. China is making active threats almost every day against Taiwan. China has eliminated entirely, in contravention of international obligations, of the special status of Hong Kong.
Right, but Mr. Shaun, Mr. Paolo, allow me for just a second. China, right, but sure. I'm sure, I think Shaun also wants to comment on what you had to say, but these countries that you mentioned, the countries that he visited, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, China does remain their top trading partner, does it not?
Sure. Does that mean that they love the situation? You cannot ignore China, the second largest economy in the world, and therefore many of these countries are tied to China with supply chains. But they also feel that China is a preponderant geopolitical presence. Remember, Vietnam and China were at war several years ago. The Chinese tried to beat the Vietnamese into submission. Didn't work too well at the time. And this is why Vietnam has tried in the intervening years to establish strong relations with the United States, the former enemy. We had a war in Vietnam, right? And guess what? They're very welcome. They used to be very welcome here in Washington. Now, with what Trump has done, who knows?
Okay. Shaun, I'll bring you in just a moment to respond to what Paolo had to say, but let me bring in Deborah into the conversation. Deborah, this trip for Xi Jinping was likely planned before all this tariff uncertainty and all the tariff chaos, right? But does it come at an opportune time, in your opinion, for not only China, but the countries that Xi Jinping is visiting as well?
I think it's a bit of a mixed blessing here, which is that, again, this trip was planned a very long time ago, and it took place then in the wake of all kinds of tariff turmoil. So I think for the countries that were receiving Xi, they appreciate the economic interconnections between markets. They appreciate having the president of China having made a personal visit to the region. I think that is always welcome in Southeast Asia. But it also creates some challenges for them, especially when it comes to balancing, because for Vietnam and Cambodia in particular, but also for Malaysia, they are also very big trading partners and have been with the United States. And so their attempt to walk a careful balance between being sort of open to all and ruled by none is a challenge. And I think this week it indicated once again how hard that tightrope is going to be to walk, because for every agreement that they may have signed with China, it puts them at risk of having a different kind of agreement from the United States and the reverse. And so I think what you saw this week was an attempt to turn this already planned state visit into a larger conversation about economics. And I think the evidence so far is a bit mixed. I think the visits appeared to go quite well. There were no diplomatic incidents. China did try to portray itself as a sensible player in the room. But the long-term implications, I think, are still a little unclear because, again, especially Vietnam, Cambodia, very tightly tied to both the U.S. and to China. And that tightrope is hard.
Okay, Shaun, let's bring you in. Look, China, as we're saying, the top trade partner of Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia individually. If you just look at Malaysia for a second, what do you think Malaysia is trying to get out of this? At the end of the day, it is home to several Belt and Road Initiative projects by the Chinese, of course.
Well, it's very clear that Malaysia is welcoming to Chinese investment. I think first, the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, he was critical of the United States. And he was saying we want a stable partnership, but some large countries, and he didn't name the U.S. directly, but it was very clear that he was talking about the United States and how you can't trust them. One day they say they're a partner, the next day they say they're not. But I totally disagree with the other guest, Paolo, and he took a very American-centric, very arrogant, unsophisticated analysis saying that Southeast Asia is all against China. And he was talking about a war that lasted a couple months between Vietnam and China 40 years ago, not looking at that there was a 10-year war between Vietnam and the United States. So I think it's very dangerous to hear views like that because it's not going on the ground and looking at what countries and what people in ASEAN are actually thinking. Look at what the Prime Minister of Malaysia said. He wants deals with China, and that's why they signed several dozen agreements where Chinese companies are going to invest in ASEAN to help create jobs, to help create economic growth in this region. There are truthfully some fears in these regions that cheap Chinese exports are going to flood these markets and put out small, medium retailers and put out manufacturers. I think China is understanding of these concerns, which is why they're supporting companies like BYD, companies like Xiaomi to set up factories throughout ASEAN to help the local economies grow. It's clear China wants a win-win relationship with these regions. And let's not be unsophisticated and say that these regions are not pushed or bullied by the United States. Let's look at Malaysia. They have invested billions and billions of dollars to become a data house center for AI over the last several years. But the Biden administration and Trump has banned the export of high-end American NVIDIA chips to Malaysia under threats of national security, which is putting a kebab in Malaysia's plans to be a data house center. So let's not say that China is bullying. We all know America is the largest bullier of the world, and I'm American. I love the United States. But if you want to be honest and you want to be fair to other peoples, it's very clear Trump is trying to hurt ASEAN. China is not. So
look,
Paolo
speaking of Trump and potentially wanting to make a deal with China, let's just listen to what he had to say earlier on.
I have a very good relationship with President Xi, and I think it's going to continue. And I would say they have reached out a number of times. I believe we're going to have a deal with China. And if we don't, we're going to have a deal anyway, because we're going to set a certain target, and that's going to be it.
Paolo, the odds of a U.S.-China trade deal, are they rising? Or, I mean, what's going on right now? Is it a matter of who blinks first? Is Trump overplaying his hand here?
The whole tariff issue has been handled by this administration in a completely confusing and confused fashion. And this applies to everybody. The notion of how great relations are between China and Asia, well, this would be another conversation, which I think would require more in-depth analysis. What I'm trying to say here is that the Trump administration has thrown on the world in general this mess of tariffs that come, that go, that are increased, that are suspended, there's a moratorium, etc. There is clearly in the United States, rightly or wrongly, which goes beyond this issue of the tariffs, their recognition that China is the biggest existential threat to the United States in modern history. That is settled. Some people may think it's wrong, that is a crazy idea, that it doesn't represent the truth, but this is the Washington consensus. The Biden administration, which didn't do any of this stuff about tariffs and what have you, President Biden, when he first came into office, says, I know Xi Jinping, I know him well, I spent hours and hours talking to him, he wants to be us, never on my watch. That's what President Biden, a Democrat, said. So this needs to be put in context. Now, regarding the tariffs
just
and how
very
we
briefly
move forward, who knows? Who knows? It's not clear how you walk back this mess of the 120%. Basically, if these tariffs stay in place, there is no way that any trade between the United States and China can go on. It's impossible.
Okay, let me bring in Deborah. Deborah, will Xi's visit to these three countries that we've seen, will this visit help or hinder these Southeast Asian states as they go about trying to negotiate their tariffs over this 90-day period?
Well, I think it's a real challenge, which is why they were trying to be very cautious about what they said and how and the manner in which they said so. 46% tariffs on Vietnam and 49% on Cambodia and a lower number on Malaysia are significant challenges for export-oriented firms in all three markets. but they're export oriented and very deeply embedded in both American and Chinese supply chains. I think we should recall that there is a lot of American investment on the ground in an awful lot of Southeast Asia, and in these three countries in particular. There's a lot of American multinationals who have been decades in the region, and again, trying to navigate this challenge between two large trade partners that are currently in a conflict is difficult. And I think you saw these three countries trying to navigate this very cautiously, very carefully. If you look at the agreements that were signed between the partners and China, there were a number of them, but they're relatively thin and they're non-binding, which suggests to me a certain amount of discomfort about signing agreements with either party at this point in time, even though they will continue to keep trade lanes and especially dialogue open, because the uncertainty is just too high. And for export-dependent markets, it matters how you position yourself, and it matters what kind of relationships you have with some of your major markets.
Deborah, just one more for you before I go on to Shaun again. But you have this 90-day window, right, in which negotiations can take place. There is some reporting coming out of the States that seems to suggest that the White House will use these upcoming negotiations with the smaller nations to pressure them into limiting their dealings with Beijing, right? How likely is that scenario?
I think that there is still confusion, even in the White House, over what their objectives are when we talk about negotiating deals. It's unclear to me what kind of deals we're looking for. Again, if I just think about the trip that Xi just had, there were, I think, a total of 70 or 80 deals officially signed of all different kinds, which reminds us again that there are big deals and small deals. There are ones that are comprehensive and difficult to negotiate and could take years. Right. There are deals that could be quite simple. And so I'm not sure yet that the White House is aware for themselves of what their approach is actually going to be. I think it will vary by country. And I'm not sure that the Southeast Asian countries know either, which is why they are trying to be as open but as cautious as they can be in approaching Washington and in keeping the trade lanes open with China.
Okay, Shaun, does Xi's visit to these countries give them sort of more bargaining power with the U.S. when it comes to any upcoming negotiations? I mean, to be courted by China demonstrates they have options, right? How will the U.S. be viewing this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, none of these countries want to choose just to be with China or just to be with the United States. They want to try to play both countries off of each other. And so I think it's a good carrot, a good card in their sleeve for Vietnam, for Malaysia to say to Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury in the United States, or to Peter Navarro when they go for negotiations, that, you know what, we have to have low tariffs from the United States. And if you don't give it to us, then we have the leverage of having some trade deals set up with China. You know, small countries around the world are complaining to me that they don't like being caught in the middle. But I think what's very important, what we've seen, is Scott Bessent has said that China doesn't have cards. And that's just not true. There's too much American arrogance. In the last week, China has stopped buying LNG gas from the US. They've stopped buying oil from America and are now buying it from Canada. They've stopped buying American beef. They're now buying beef from Australia. They're not buying soybeans from the United States. They're now buying soybeans from Brazil. So what you can see is China is getting more leverage over the United States in these trade negotiations, while Trump has already folded by giving exemptions for imports of iPhones and computers. The Chinese people have the resolve and they have the demand to push back very strongly against Trump in the United States right now. They are willing and prepared to go for years, maybe decades, to withstand American bullying. I don't think the Americans can last a week without an iPhone.
Hang on. Let's give the final word then to Paolo. So is there a risk for the U.S., Paolo, in this scenario that all this chaos from the tariffs and all this uncertainty might let countries start to see China as a more reliable country to do business with? I mean, is that a worry in the U.S.?
It should be. I'm afraid I have no idea what the thinking is in the White House regarding all this. If the idea is let the whole world gang up against China, assuming that this is a wise policy and an achievable policy, you don't achieve it by in creating adversarial relations with the rest of the world, starting with our next door neighbors, Canada, for God's sake, where we have it's an ally, where for decades or centuries, the fact that we create inimical relations with Ottawa is absolutely bizarre. Mexico is a different story, it's more complicated, but relations with the European Union, same thing, and the rest of the world. If there was an effort to isolate China, well, the first thing you would do is to have closer relations with the other countries that are definitely worried about China, and I'm afraid there are many of them. And the Quad, the reestablishment and the beefing up of the Quad under the Biden administration is evidence to this. India is worried about China. Australia is worried about China. Not to mention Japan and South Korea, very worried about China. Not necessarily about trade, about geopolitics, about the attitude of China vis-a-vis its neighbors and the rest of the world. Like, this is a different issue. But regarding the tariffs and the impact, there are two things. How does it work with American consumers? Very badly. Most consumer goods in the United States, particularly low-end, or rather I would say cheap, inexpensive consumer goods, are bought by low-income Americans who happen to be the Trump political base. They voted for him because he said, you are doing poorly economically. I'm going to fix all this. In 1 minute, prices will go down, inflation will go down. Thank God you voted for me because the golden age has started. Well,
Right.
if the beginning of the golden age is when a shopper goes to Walmart and finds, imported Chinese goods that now are marked up 70, 80% in terms of the price to the consumer, that's not exactly the golden age. So there is a huge potential downside economically and, quite frankly, politically for the
Okay.
Trump administration in this tariff thing. Can China absorb, if I may finish, China is not in a position to absorb its enormous excess production in the domestic market. There
Okay,
is
we'll
no
have to
domestic
leave it
market.
there. Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining us, Shaun, Rein, Deborah, Elms, and Paolo von Schirach. We appreciate your time on Inside Story. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.